Hey everyone, Lance Martin again, Global Banker Town & Country. We are here for part 2 of our real estate market forecast. Before I introduce Manfred Keil, I did want to take a moment to thank our sponsors. With the event changing and us no longer doing it at the Fox Theater, all of our sponsors had an opportunity to pull out and basically say thank you, but they didn't. So a special thank you to Back Porch Homes, Homebridge Mortgage, and frankly, a company that's near and dear to us, which is Cobalt Property Management. It's a subsidiary and part of Global Banker Town & Country. So a big thank you to our sponsors for their support in this event. So now on to Manfred. I've got Manfred Keil here with Claremont McKenna College. He is the Associate Professor of Economics there. He's first-time speaker for the 2020, or any market forecast for that matter, so we're really excited to have him. So I want to thank you and welcome Manfred Keil with Claremont McKenna College.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I wish we had the usual forum so that I could see in your faces perhaps what you're thinking. But this is what we have to do, and that's what we will go with. So let me talk about the current state of the economy as we see it. And that's tricky because a lot of the data that we would like to have at this point is not yet available. So let me step back a little and show you what life might look like. And if you think this is this week's Fortune magazine, it's not. It's from 2018. So there was a lot of talk in 2018 whether or not we were going into a recession. And Fortune magazine looked at a variety of indicators and wasn't quite sure what would happen. The signal was sort of muddled. Maybe we're coming to the end of the expansion, maybe not. The Economist, same thing in 2018. So I guess I'm stressing that there was sort of talk about the end of the expansion that we had. And the reason perhaps is that we have had a record-breaking economic expansion in terms of all the expansions following World War II. So different from what people make you believe, a recession is not if you have 2 quarters of negative growth. There's actually what is called a dating committee, the dating committee at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and they said recessions by month, actually not by quarter. And according to that, the last recession started December 2007, and it ended in June of 2009. If you went by the old definition of 2 quarters of negative growth, the Great Recession, as it was labeled, would not even have started until the summer, because in the second quarter of 2008, this is before the fall of Lehman Brothers, there was the tax rebate by Bush, and we had a very small positive growth. So according to that, the Great Recession would not even have started. But this dating committee at the National Bureau of Economic Research, which sits between Harvard and MIT and Cambridge, decided, with hindsight, took them quite a while, that the recession started in December. There is no reason to think that recessions in the Inland Empire will start with the national recession, but perhaps you can think of this as a national disease that starts earlier in some parts and gets later in other parts. At the Low Institute at Claremont McKenna College, we have a large number of research assistants, and we date recessions differently for the Inland Empire. At some point, we were tempted to call the committee that decides on the recession the Student Faculty Dating Committee, but that would not have been given the right signal to you what this is about. So, at any rate, here are the recessions, and what this graph is trying to show is that the expansion that we had since the June of 2009 was the longest in the history of expansions that we've had. So one of the questions is, do expansions die of old age? And that was sort of the thought in 2018. Maybe they die of old age just like humans die of old age. The oldest person in the world is somebody called Tanaka. She lives in Japan. In January 2019, she turned, or 2020, she turned 117. And eventually, Ms. Tanaka will die, but she will not really die of old age. She will die of some different cause that perhaps happened during her lifetime. when we talk about recessions, then you look sort of at the blue line, and there is some increase in economic activity until you reach the peak, and then you go into a recession, you reach the trough, and then you come back up. One of the tasks for forecasters is to find other series that turn before. So the yellow series here goes down before the recession starts, and therefore it forecasts what we will have a downturn, and again, when we will have an upturn. These are called leading economic indicators. And I will show you what some of these looked like in 2018, why there was talk about potentially a recession. So here is the unemployment rate for both the Inland Empire, that's the blue line, the top, for California and for the United States. The bars here are recession dates as dated by the National Bureau of Economic Research. We cannot have data prior to 1990 for the Inland Empire, so that's why we start in 1990. The peace dividend for the Inland Empire and for California was not as nice as it was for the rest of the United States. You can see in the 1990 recession, the Inland Empire shot up, and it went first and steepest. Then compared to California, neither California nor the Inland Empire benefited from military bases and Air Force bases being shut down. So that recession actually was quite severe for the Inland Empire, and it took a long time for us to recover. Then comes the recession of 2000, which is the dot-com recession, and that was really centered in Northern California. So Southern California actually did quite well. The Inland Empire, as you can see, went below the California unemployment rate. And then, of course, comes the Great Recession. And that Great Recession started first, or was visible first, in the Inland Empire. We had a peak in employment in construction as early as March 2006, if you look at seasonally adjusted data. Housing prices, as you may remember, peaked in Los Angeles in the summer of 2007. And then the unemployment rate went up by quite a bit, reaching a level of 10% at the national level, much higher in California and even higher in the Inland Empire. So we reached over 14%. And even that hides differences regionally. For example, for the city of Coachella and for the city of Adelanto, unemployment rates reached 22% at the time, pretty much unheard of in regular times. So what I'm trying to show you here is, believe it or not, the Inland Empire is what we call FILO, first in, last out, right? And it's surprising because you would think that the Inland Empire reacts to what is happening in the greater Los Angeles area. But for some reason that I will get into later on, which involves commuters, we will actually see a lot of times the recession happening first in the Inland Empire before it reaches the center. In many ways, you can think of a frozen lake, and a lake freezes from the periphery, and it thaws the other way around. So the leading indicator for unemployment is that typically it forecasts a recession if over the last 3 months the unemployment rate went up compared to what it was the year before. Well, before the current events, there was no evidence whatsoever of a recession coming up, in the sense that we were at an unemployment rate of 3.6% for the United States and roughly 4% for California and the Inland Empire. These are historical lows. So there was no evidence of that happening here. This one is a more interesting one that will play a lot of significance down the road in this talk, and it's consumer sentiment. So the University of Michigan every month asks individuals, what is your outlook on the immediate future? Even though this is not exactly the question, I will tell you it's something of the order, over the next 6 months, are you planning to buy an iPhone, let's say? And according to that, they have an index, and that index did go down several times late in the summer, sort of coinciding with trade talks stalling. There was at some point Trump coming on in the summer of 2019 saying that we're not making the progress that we had hoped to make. And consumer sentiment in that case went down. But it did not go down recently until the very last observations in February and the early observations that we have in March. So the problem is this is only published monthly. It's not like the equivalent of a stock market index or some exchange rates for which we have information minute by minute, right? So this is information that we get once a month. And here was the information that we received. It's sort of at record highs. And then in the second half of February, there were indications that people were thinking in a more negative way about the future. But for the months as a whole, that wasn't reflected. They started to put in comments with regard to the coronavirus. And for March, we have not had the publication of the index. It will not come out until the end of the month. However, there is an early indication from interviews that they made until the 15th that this index will fall to at least 85, if not more. And that would be quite a bit of a drop. I would think if we come to the end of April, this will fall significantly more, and we will go down in some territories that we haven't seen for quite a while. This is something interesting. This is called the yield curve. And the yield curve is the difference between the 10-year government bond rate and the 3-month Treasury bill. And the funny thing is that typically the yield curve is positive, meaning that long-term interest rates are higher than short-term interest rates. However, there are occasions when it turns negative. And here comes the point that I'm going to make here. The yield curve has not had false negatives. In other words, every time that the yield curve went negative, there was a recession subsequently. And you can trace this back to the late 1960s. The yield curve did go negative on the 22nd of March of 2019. I remember that because for me that was big news. And it suggested that we were going to have a recession at some point. And this is a year ago. We had no idea about the coronavirus, right? So this was the strongest indicator that the current expansion was coming to an end. If you wish, one of the ways to think of it is that if people have less trust in the stock market, they will shift into long-term bonds. And that means they will buy long-term bonds. The price of long-term bonds is going to go up. And by identity, the interest rate is going to go down. And that happened until very recently when it has been positive. Mind you, there have been periods when it was negative and then positive. And then subsequently there was a recession nevertheless. One thing I can say for sure, this yield, the spread having gone negative, had nothing to do with the coronavirus, but it was a warning signal. So here's a graph that I think particularly bankers are interested in. It's housing starts. And if you look at the average number of housing starts in the United States, and you form an average from 1955 to 2006, that average is basically at 1,500 a month. And yes, it does go above, sometimes below, but 1,500 a month is what it takes. That's of course in thousands. And this is annualized, meaning you have to multiply the monthly numbers by 12. This is stunning. And Chris Thornburg referred to that in his talk as well. If you look at this graph, there is something that is very, very different in this expansion from previous expansions. And it is simply the low number of housing starts. We did not even reach that 1,500,000 until very recently. And if you look at the data more carefully, spread it out, you will actually see that matters didn't look good at all. In 2018, that was when the Federal Reserve raised the interest rates 3 times. And it became much better last year. We had a mini boom because the Federal Reserve lowered the interest rates 3 times. And it actually is visible in the data. But at any rate, this is one of the great puzzles of the current expansion. Why is it that housing starts remain so low? And even though economic data that we have recently is really positive, it took a long time to get there. It took a long time for us to recover employment losses. The housing market never picked up like we wanted it to. Growth has slowed down and so forth. At any rate, this was a warning signal. And I want to put a positive spin on it. Typically, the reason why expansions die is not really because of old age. It is because something that happened early on in the expansion. Think of humans. Why do they die? They don't really die of old age. It's because they die early if they have been fed a lot of hamburgers and French fries early on in their life. So here it is the Federal Reserve that feeds the market something. And housing starts were quite low. That means the accumulation of housing is not really what it was in previous expansions. There's a variety of facts that can kill an expansion. One of them is a monetary contraction. The other one is oil prices. But one is a buildup of inventories in automobiles, in housing. And what you can see here is, even though we've had the longest expansion, we never accumulated the number of houses that we had in the previous expansion or the one before. So if you wanted to hear why the expansion lasted so long, is because things were different in this expansion. That is sort of how we pinned our hope on not forecasting a recession. Well, and these are the sort of talks I gave until March 4th. So on March 4th, I get up in the morning and I realize I have to make a presentation in the afternoon. And I look at the news from the previous day, which was Tuesday the 3rd, and I just am stunned by some of the news that I'm reading. The first one was that the Federal Reserve Board lowered the federal funds rate, meaning its rate by which it interacts with the commercial banks, or the rate at which commercial banks interact with each other, but it is set or influenced by the Federal Reserve. It lowered it by 50 basis points, half a percentage point. And that is unheard of. I mean, you have to go back all the way to 2008 to see an increase or drop of more than 25 basis points. And so on top of it, this decision was made between meetings. So the regular meetings are scheduled, and here the Federal Reserve got together between meetings and in a unanimous vote, which also has not happened a lot recently, decided that they needed to lower the federal funds rate by 50 basis points. This is when I am sitting there saying, something is happening. Something is happening that perhaps I'm not aware of, that I really have to pay attention to, because this is a big event. Then I find out that the Australians, the day before, actually, they're, as you know, ahead of us in time, did the same thing. They lowered their interest rate. Australia, for what it's worth, is an interesting case because currently the longest expansion in OECD history, which is the Rich Countries Club, the longest expansion is Australia. They have not had a recession since 1991. I have a colleague, of course, Australian colleague who lives in London, and I asked him once, why is that? And he said one sentence, dig it up and sell it to the Chinese. Well, that's not a lot of advice for most countries, right? So in other words, the Australians have been lucky in terms of raw material prices and in terms of raw material that they shipped to China. At any rate, they knew something was going bad. Hong Kong, Malaysia follow. The group of 7 says we will need a stimulus. South Korea announces $8 billion of expenditures. You know, when it comes to billions, it is sometimes, it's hard for us to comprehend what this means, because we're able to work in thousands of dollars, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars. $1 million for us is already somewhat hard to understand. $1 billion, I tell you what $1 billion is. If you take a dollar note and you put down $1 note every second, guess how long it takes you to get to $1 billion? And don't be a smart ass like one of my students who will say 1 billion seconds. It takes 31 years to get to that. So 1 billion is quite a large number. Now here it comes. The Obama administration had a rescue package of $787 billion. That's in 2008. What does that mean? We cannot comprehend this. Here's how you can comprehend it. On the day when Jesus Christ was born, if every day subsequently you spend $1 million, $1 million a day, you will not get to $787 billion. So we must have been in one hellhole in 2008 to need that sort of money to come out of it. Anyways, that's 8 billion that the Koreans do. Here, closer to my heart, because I grew up in Germany, all of a sudden you realize that big events are being canceled. This is all happening in the same week. The Italians have a game between Inter Milan and Juventus Turin. That's number 1 against number 2, or 2 against number 1. And they have to play it in front of 0 audience. No audience was allowed in. This is unheard of. This is as if you played late in the season in American football, 2 of the top teams against each other in front of an empty stadium. My hometown team, Eintracht Frankfurt, its game against Basel was completely cancelled because the Swiss decided they will not have any sports event anymore at all. Of course, then, we get to hear about the NBA, the NHL. Ukraine stunned me. When Ukraine flew back people from Wuhan, there were demonstrations at the airport where people wanted to throw rocks at the airplane because they were so upset that the Ukrainian government would even let people in who had been to Wuhan. These are situations that we have never heard of before. Of course, we're running out of hand sanitizers and other material. The Federal Reserve, in this statement of why they thought they needed to have this much of a decrease, Powell comes on and makes a statement. Some people at the time said, this is a supply chain problem. This is a problem that affects China, and we will have not enough material coming into firms like Apple and so forth. So it's a supply chain problem. Why does the Federal Reserve lower the federal funds rate? Powell, from the beginning, made it very clear. He says, we get it. We're not working on the supply chain. We cannot fix the virus. We cannot fix supply problems. What we're working on is the demand side. We know that this will generate a huge drop in consumer sentiment. Consumers will stay home, they will not spend, and we have to make sure that somehow spending power gets into the economy. So he says this early on. I wanted to make the comparison here. Empty shelves is when you have a supply side problem. It doesn't matter if the shelves are empty or not, if there are no customers, right? That's the crucial thing. No customer means you have a demand going down, right? So, talking about the Inland Empire and the forecasts I want to make, it is very hard to make any forecast at the moment. I think what we have to do is we have to build up 2 scenarios. One is an optimistic one, and in the optimistic one, we will claim that everything will be okay by the 2nd week of May. Is this unreasonable? Think about China. So China really started to lock down in February, at the beginning of February, late in January. They are now coming to the point where people again are allowed to travel, not out of Wuhan, but in the rest of the country. So it took them 2 months to get things under control. And I think that would be an optimistic scenario that we're looking at. The pessimistic scenario is we cannot get the coronavirus under control, and then we have just gone from DEFCON 4 to DEFCON 3. By the way, if you don't know this, DEFCON 1 is the worst, not the other way around. So here is a distinction that I want to make, and perhaps this is a way for me to give you the same forecast as Chris made. I want to make a distinction between a contraction and a recession. In the end, the effect is the same. GDP will decrease, the unemployment rates will go down. But I want to think of a contraction as the equivalent of an induced coma of a boxer, right? So in other words, recessions, as we discussed before, happen because there's some shock to the economy, and that throws it off if the shock is, as Chris calls it, big enough and persistent enough. This is different. Here, the policymakers have decided to induce a coma by making people stay at home. And think of the US economy as a human body, and there are doctors around, and the doctors are those who run fiscal policy and monetary policy. By the way, those two policies is the medicine that they can administer. And at the moment, we're at a point where we have the medicine ready in the sense that the fiscal stimulus package will go into effect today, and the Fed has already acted. But the question is, when do you want to take the patient out of the coma? And there has been talk, as you know, by President Trump that we should do this by Easter, but other people have disagreed with that. So the crucial question is, when do we want to take the boxer out of the coma? And then the question is, once he's out of the coma, how long does he have to stay in the hospital before he recovers? I think that's the proper analogy, in the sense that this is a downturn like no other before. I'll call it a contraction because it is induced by policy makers. It is not the result of some usual candidate of causing a recession. Here's what you need to know about the Inland Empire and how it is affected by it. The Inland Empire is both Riverside County and San Bernardino County together. It is also called sometimes the Riverside-San Bernardino, Ontario, MSA, called a Metropolitan Statistical Area. In the United States, we have 380 some metropolitan statistical areas, the largest one being New York, the second largest one being Greater Los Angeles, and that would be Los Angeles County and Orange County. Chris mentioned this. Here is a bar chart of the size of the population of the MSAs. And there we are. We're in position number 13. So out of 380, we are the 13th largest MSA in the United States. 10% of California lives in the Inland Empire. We are a third of the size of the Greater Los Angeles area. We are just a little bit smaller than the San Francisco MSA, but we're bigger, for example, than the San Diego MSA. So this is important to realize sort of the power, potential power that we have. There are a lot of people living in the Inland Empire. Here's something that is not so pleasant. This is a measure of per capita GDP. That means output produced in an area and divided it by the population. This is important. This does not include the output that is produced by commuters. And therefore, we are only ranked way out there, somewhere around 250 or so, and surrounded by areas where I wouldn't even know where they are. So this is a very different picture, right? And this is important to understand the Inland Empire. A lot of people there, but the value added that we produce within the Inland Empire is actually not that great, and that's why we commute. This was interesting. About 3 years ago, we said, let's get away from these average commuting numbers. They don't really tell us anything. I, for example, live in Upland, which is in the Inland Empire. I work in Claremont. That's a commute of 5 minutes for me. I should walk, but as you know, nobody walks in LA, so I drive. But if you mix that number with those who drive for 5 hours a day, then the average becomes lower. So what we did here is we went to Google Maps. And we looked at sort of 6 interesting drives that we could come up with. Maybe the one here to focus on is Upland to downtown LA. And then we looked at when is this drive the longest, which day of the week at what time, and when is it the shortest. And the number we came up with in general was if you drive west or south, if you're on the 15, on a Thursday morning at 7 o'clock, and if you come back at 5 p.m. in the afternoon. The distance between Upland to downtown LA is 37 miles. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that if you drive 65 miles an hour, it will take you 37 minutes to get there. If you leave, or if you used to leave, in Upland at 7 o'clock in the morning, it would take you 2 hours and 10 minutes to get downtown. Coming back, it would take you 2 hours 20. That's a total of 4 hours and 50 of a commute. And let's face it, no one likes to commute. You don't do it because it's a pleasure. You do it because somehow the qualifications that you have seem to be above a job perhaps that you can get in the Inland Empire on average, and you will get better paid downtown. That's why you commute. Otherwise, why would you commute? Then I went into the same site last Thursday, well, actually last Wednesday. So Governor Newsom posted restrictions on Thursday in terms of essential businesses staying open, but non-essentials closing. And this is the difference. For the drives I just had, if you looked at what happened on Wednesday, the day before the announcement, the decline was already substantial, right? And this is before Governor Newsom acts. So in many ways, the driving times were halved. For Upland to downtown, it was an hour and 5 minutes, right? So that means already people were not as much on the road as they were before. Of course, if you do this now, you get to 37 minutes, right? Are we alone in this? This is major cities in the world. So everyone is experiencing it. By the way, Tokyo is not. This is in some ways the puzzle that the Tokyo or the Japanese government had, saying we have not been that much affected other than the cruise ship that let off passengers in Tokyo. The other town that is not as much affected is London, by the way. I assume that will change. We're not alone in this. This is not comforting. It means it is happening everywhere, right? Some pretty pictures from the LA Times. This is a picture of what is happening in the coastal areas. The stores are basically closed. We know that the schools are shut. And these are stunning photos. I cannot make them, I have to admit. And this is the beach. This is basically during your spring break, when if you had gone to Acapulco, you would be now doing a foam party. Here you're sort of stuck by yourself, and you're certainly not going to Mexico to a foam party. This is a picture that I took, obviously not of the same quality as the previous pictures from the LA Times. But this is last Thursday when I came from a presentation and I went to Trader Joe's. And I made it to Trader Joe's at noon. And this is what the aisle looked like for the meat. It was nothing. It was gone. Forget toilet paper. Well, you don't go to Trader Joe's for toilet paper anyway. But it's the same way the aisle looked for bread. It's the same way that the aisle looked for frozen food. You have never seen something like this. Maybe when I visited East Germany before German unification, in some stores it looked like this. But we have never experienced like this. And that's sort of where the anxiety comes from. If you had to make a choice of, if you had to find one word for economics, such as if my mother asked me when I was in college, what is economics about? And I would say, well, Mom, it has to do with people maximizing utilities subject to it. And she would say, no, it's too complicated. Can you just give me one word? And I would have said choice. So that's what economics is about. Another big word is opportunity cost. What do you have to give up in order to obtain one more? And in principles textbooks, we have these silly examples of you maybe have to give up a hamburger in order to buy 2 hot dogs or something like this. This is a good example of opportunity cost. But there you are. Speaking of toilet paper, there were calls to 911 because people ran out of toilet paper. This was in Oregon, in a coastal town called Newport. And I'll let you read through this. Here's some advice that the police department gave to callers, what they could use if they ran out of toilet paper instead. There are other alternatives that I'd rather not discuss in front of the camera that typically involve corn on the cob and so forth, but you can Google them and you will be amused at any rate. So don't, as I talked yesterday to a police chief, don't call the police if you run out of toilet paper, right? So here's another example of opportunity cost. So the headlines yesterday in the New York Times and the LA Times was that Trump is now considering opening the US economy with Eastern. As a matter of fact, he was hoping that a lot of people will go to church at Eastern. I find that to be not the sort of best advice in the current situation. And the idea here is there is a trade-off in terms of us suffering from the disease versus us suffering from the economic consequences. And which one is heavier, right? In other words, if there is an economic downturn, there are a lot of ills that come with it. There are more suicides, there are more violence at domestic violence and what have you. So this is all an interesting discussion, but not a discussion really that exists currently in many other countries. Here's the problem. We are worried about this curve not having flattened. So there's very recent data of total corona cases in the world other than China. So China is over the problem. What we want to see in order for our optimistic forecast to hold is that this curve flattens out, right? And if this curve starts to flatten out within the next 2 to 3 weeks, then we are there going towards a more optimistic scenario. These are the new corona cases. This is the same thing. We need for that curve to flatten out. I've excluded China because they had the episode earlier. This one is a particularly scary graph. It compares the number of cases from the initial outbreak in a country. So that's day 0. And as you can see, the picture is very similar for most countries. There is an increase initially, and then it stays flat for a while. And that's probably because of people coming from Wuhan, and they're infected, they infect some other people as they enter the country, but then it stays flat. Then it takes off. And the US is down here. That is worrisome, because the US should be higher. And this is where the fear is that inadequate testing that we had does not really tell us the number of cases we've had. And we are now only seeing in New York and in California and in Washington State what that increase will be like. And that increase is scary, and we're not seeing the worst of it yet. So I want to show you a simulation of 200 people infecting each other, or starting with one, that was posted in the Washington Post. You can go to this site and you can look at it. Other than that, I will try to play it for you so that you see what this is all about. So this is a simulation of 200 people moving around and either being infected or carrying the virus. And once the dots turn purple, then you're immune because you had been infected, and now you have built up an immune system, so you do not infect other people. The curve at the top shows the outbreak going through. In this simulation, you're basically looking at the Chinese scenario. There's a barrier, meaning you lock off Wuhan completely, and so all the infections happen here. But then after a while, you relax that barrier, and of course now the people who are infected move into the general population and infect the others as well. But you can see how much flatter the curve is. So in this simulation, people are staying in place, meaning they're staying home and they're not moving around. And the point here is, the simulation shows by how much the outbreak is being slowed down, simply by these people not moving around, and eventually if they become infected, they will get immune. So this is an example of social distancing. There are people who are moving around, they're infecting people, but a lot of people are staying in place. And so in order for you to get infected, somebody has to come from the outside and be in contact with you. But as you can see, this is really what slows down the outbreak. And then the final simulation is a super lockdown. As you can see, only 8% of the population is moving around at all. Everyone else stays put in their houses. And this is the idea of flattening the curve. Here, you can see that there are not a lot of infections, and therefore the health system will not be as much taxed as it is otherwise. So given these different outcomes, and by the way, there's also a slightly negative possibility that wasn't shown in the simulations, namely, let's say you keep all the children at home at the moment, but eventually they will be taken back to school and therefore could be infected because by now they haven't built up an immune system. Then there will be a second wave that happens from September until November. But that's also a flatter curve, and we don't have to be concerned at the moment. Here's the way to look at the US economy. You should think of the US economy as an oil tanker. And it's an oil tanker that even if you turn the rudder, it takes a while for it to move. And the captain is somebody who is in charge of fiscal or monetary policy. And the problem is the tanker has gone into a fog bank. It knows that there are some icebergs in there, and its radar doesn't work. That's the problem we have at the moment. We don't get the data that we want to see. All these things that happen in regular recessions, such as the leading economic indicators, they don't show anything at the moment, right? So the oil tanker is in there, and you're trying to figure out what to do to get out of it. And so here is our preliminary estimate of GDP, which is available from the Federal Reserve, but it is not made available until after the quarter is over. If we really think that the second quarter will show the steepest decline in GDP, we won't even know these numbers until after the end of the second quarter. So we won't even know it until June, or even after that. The same thing with the unemployment rate. In order to figure out what the current unemployment rate is, unemployment rates are published on the first Friday of every month. So we won't even know what the March unemployment rates are until April 2nd. That's what I mean with a tanker going into a fog bank and not having a radar. We don't know what is going on at the moment. So what we try to do is try to get around it. One possibility is, if you have never used Google Trends, I advise you to do that. It's for free. You just go to Google and Google Trends, and it will send you to a site, and you can put in any word that you would like to put in. I put in recession and looked over the last 12 months, right? And it will tell you in the United States how many hits you get on it, and then you can restrict it to an area. You can restrict it by state or by country, right? And so here is what I was talking about before. Last summer, there was this idea many people had, maybe we're moving into a recession, and that had to do with stalled trade talks and this sort of thing. This is what happened last week. I mean, clearly people are concerned. So this is the last Google trend I did on recession, and there's clearly a spike. People know there is a recession coming up. Now, I can go all the way back to 2004. So Google Trend didn't exist before 2004. And so this here is the Great Recession. The problem about Google Trends is if it hits 100, it will generate a ceiling. So in other words, once it hits 100, all these subsequent ones will not be above 100 unless another one breaks through. And the current Googling of a recession is as high as it was during the Great Recession, right? Now, maybe it is because we have more internet users than we had in 2008, but we're just at the beginning of this. It is clear that recession is on everyone's mind. So here are initial unemployment rate claims. And this is sort of data that will show you if people are unemployed, if people are unemployed, they will go and look for unemployment benefits. And that number went up by 70,000 last week. Here's the scary part. We don't know the most recent data, and the estimate is that it will go up by, get this, 2 million, right? This is unheard of. We are in one scary situation. And again, this is published weekly, so this is a number that will come out soon, right? Then I started to get a bit more innovative. I looked for unemployment applications and I restricted it to the state of California, our state. And here's the interest of it over time. This, again, is the Great Recession. And you can see that people are searching. They're searching for either unemployment offices, which is what Paul Krugman suggested in the New York Times, or, in my case, unemployment applications. The advantage is that this works for you. It's like you have a new type of radar. It allows you to investigate the current economic situation. Consumer sentiment index we talked about before is at a point where it hasn't shown yet the decline, but we should get data by the end of the month, so this will add to our radar. Here is the forecast of 43 professional economists surveyed by the Wall Street Journal. And these are the people who work at JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs, at Barclays and what have you. And they were allowed to give their estimate for a pessimistic scenario, for a baseline one, and for an optimistic one. And then these are the median numbers. So if the pessimistic median number is -10, that might include someone from Goldman Sachs saying it's -30, right? It's just in the middle of that distribution. Okay, so if you look at these numbers, we are looking in the current quarter, in the pessimistic view, at a decline of 10%. That is huge. It is unheard of. Rebounding somewhat in the next quarter by 3.8%. So compare this to my scenario. I said on a good day, we will get out of this within the next 2 months. That's still in the second quarter, right? So we would be out of this by the third quarter. And even so, you are still at -3.8%. Mind you, in the optimistic view, you're now getting into the positive range. Unemployment rates are not as severe as Treasury Secretary Mnuchin suggested. He suggested they might reach 20%. But the pessimistic view, even the pessimistic view, doesn't get you to more than 7.4%. We are more pessimistic, particularly in terms of the Inland Empire, and I will talk about that a little bit more. The Inland Empire, as you saw in previous graphs, sees the increases in unemployment rates by much more. So here's our optimistic scenario. We're getting out of this by the second week of May. Second week of April, the curves will flatten. There are other conditions that hopefully will be met. There is talk about some medicine that already exists for other diseases that perhaps can be used to make this a more bearable of an outbreak. And then, of course, there's hope that within 12 months we will have a vaccine. If that happens, then here is your litmus test of whether we're in the optimistic scenario or not. If it happens, the Coachella Festival and the Stagecoach Festival will take place. I'm not saying that these are events that have huge multiplier effects for the United States, although for the Coachella Valley, you should notice that the Coachella Festival generates $400 million in terms of revenue for it and for the surrounding areas. So it is quite a large event. I'm not trying to downplay that. But if Coachella happens in October, then that will be a signal that other events are happening as well. Finally, UCLA and USC will start classes, and my college, Claremont McKenna College, and Chris's, he works at University of California at Riverside, they will also have classes. Right now, we do what all the other colleges are doing. which is we're teaching classes online. If that is the case, we will have a national recession. This is what the NBR will call it. They will have a recession that started in March of 2020, meaning now. And it will be over in September. So a short but sharp recession. In the pessimistic scenario, which is Coachella will not happen, we're not containing the virus, you can easily see that, for example, if the vaccine is not developed for the next 18 months, that we will be in what the NBR will call a national recession until the middle of 2021. So that's a scary scenario, and we have to hope that this is the scenario that we will see. What are the industries that are most affected? Well, we'll talk about them specifically at the end, but obviously leisure and hospitality is one of the biggest ones that is being hit. I'll give you an example when I started to realize how much of an impact this virus has on California. I looked up how many direct flights there were per week between China and California. So these are direct flights either into LAX or San Francisco, SFO. And there were 145 of those flights. That to me initially seemed big, but I tend to work in the summer in Korea at Yonsei University, and so I know that every day there are 2 direct flights on Korea Air, 2 direct flights on Air Asiana. There are 2 direct flights out of San Francisco and Los Angeles for United, Delta, and American. So that's 10. So per week that would be 70. So 145 does not seem to be that much. And then I made the following calculations. Let's say each one of these flights has 300 people on it. There are obviously planes like the A383 that has many, many more people on it. Let's make it 300. And let's say that each one of these people on it stays for 14 days. And then on top of it, that they will spend every day $100 US. That's not that much once you take into account going to Disneyland and staying in a hotel and what have you. If that happens, then your loss per month is $250 million in California. If you look at this for 4 months, then it's $1 billion. And we just talked about what a billion is. This is huge. Total Chinese tourist spending was $4 billion in 2019. Meaning, even if we come out of this bad situation we're currently in with the virus, it will take a while before the Chinese are coming again and before people are willing to travel again. Either way, the quarter, if you want to know which quarter it started, obviously it's starting in the second quarter. The effect on Inland Empire. So one of our most important sectors is logistics. What is logistics? Logistics is transportation and warehousing. And on top of it, because John Husing told me a while ago to include wholesale trade, we include wholesale trade. What the problem is here is that we have had a 20% reduction in container imports. We don't care that much about exports. You have to think about that 40% of all US imports, not into the West Coast, go through 2 ports. And those are the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles. So 40% of all imports go through. From the beginning of the year, we have had over 50 ships not arriving from China, right? So container traffic is now down by 20%. During the Great Recession, at the maximum, it was down by 25%. And so that means that immediately we will get at least a 6% reduction in employment in that sector, and that is a very important sector for the Inland Empire. Now, Chris will say that sector will boom because of warehouses being filled up with goods from Amazon and so forth. It is true that, of course, Amazon is planning to hire 100,000 people. So there will be traffic that comes from other parts of the United States being shipped, particularly into Ontario Airport. UPS has a huge facility there. But it will not make up at all for the impact it will have from the container traffics. You have to think of, you cannot store things in Long Beach and Los Angeles at the ports because there's no space to store it. So what happens is containers are being shipped out here and then sometimes redistributed, reassembled, and things are being then shipped out from here. We need a strong fiscal stimulus, and I hope by the time I finish my talk that Congress has passed a $2 trillion package, which is what we're talking about at the moment. To put that into perspective, $2 trillion is 10% of all US GDP. It's huge. And on top of it, we want the central bank the Fed, in other words, to continue with what is called monetary easing or quantitative easing. So that's the scenario for the US economy and the impact that we have from the coronavirus. But just like Chris yesterday, or just like Chris a week ago, I want to talk a little bit about structural problems that potentially are in the Inland Empire, and particularly the impact that the fourth industrial revolution will have on employment in the Inland Empire. So here was a presentation I made on February 5th. Again, this is before we knew sort of the virus outbreak. And I wanted to say at the time, what will be the sectors in the Inland Empire that will be the strongest ones? Here's a graph that Chris referred to. What I've done is I've looked at California, the Inland Empire, and the United States. So black is the United States, red is California, yellow is the Inland Empire. And I started to look at employment starting in July 2007. Remember, the Great Recession did not start until December, but employment in the Inland Empire fell earlier. With hindsight, we should have known. And as you can see, there is not much that is happening at the Great Recession initially in the United States. In the Inland Empire, we saw things going south and ended up with a loss of 12% of all jobs. That's every eighth person losing the job. And then we sort of just go along at the bottom. And even when the United States and California are starting to pick up, nothing is happening in the Inland Empire. Remember my line, first in, last out. And then the Inland Empire takes off. We have become the rocket ship. I mean, you're looking at employment in the Inland Empire from this low point having increased by 38%. If you look at the newspaper, you never see anything about this. You hear about North Dakota. Well, North Dakota is in the headlines because how many extra people did they employ last year? 17, 18, maybe? A joke. Okay, so it is a bit more, but nothing compared to the masses that we have employed here. We have employed more people here going up than Silicon Valley has. So maybe that's unfair because Silicon Valley is not as big in terms of population as the Inland Empire is. But the MSA next to us in terms of population size, San Francisco, has not had that sort of increase that we have had. So we should be happy. We should be out here saying it is fantastic, the Inland Empire is booming and all is good. Is that so? Well, just because we lost some jobs, and remember, if you look at the previous graph, what is remarkable is it took until 2014 to recover these jobs. This is sort of a first, that it took 7 years for the United States and for California and for the Inland Empire to recover the jobs that were lost. But were they evenly distributed? In other words, just because we get back to where we were before, that doesn't mean you get the same jobs back, right? In other words, if you have someone working in manufacturing and in construction and they lose their job and next day they find a job as a valet attendant or selling T-shirts in Cabazon, then the amount of employment has stayed the same, but the jobs haven't stayed the same, right? And so what do we see here? Well, those are the two losers. It's construction and manufacturing. We know that. That's everywhere in the United States. Those two sectors went down, right? And that's painful because they have relatively well-paying jobs. Who was the big winner? This guy here, which is health and education. And if you look more carefully at the data, it's really health. So that sector never showed a decline, right? This one is the interesting one, logistics. Initially we go down because the Great Recession means in the rest of the United States GDP goes down, and so therefore people consume less, and so therefore they also consume less imports. And that's what logistics is about in the Inland Empire. But then we pick up big time. What's the other sector that has really benefited? Leisure and hospitality, plus government, right? All the other sectors have not, and here's the most important one. Professional and business services, which is a well-paying job, has not picked up in the Inland Empire. And I will show you the same picture that I'm showing you here for California and for the United States. And that is the big difference. So in this case, you will have, again, big increases in health, big decreases in employment in construction and manufacturing, but there's a pickup in professional and business services. And the same thing is happening here. So in both cases, California and the United States, you get an increase in well-paying jobs that you do not see in the Inland Empire. This is the Inland Empire. If I do this in annual data, instead of just showing you the overall outcome since 2007, this is what we're well aware of. Construction has picked up, but not really to where it was. Government has become bigger. Healthcare, big increases, right? This is our problem. Professional and business services, not really shown any increase. This is the data from a year ago. Last year, construction did well. Not initially in the year, but once the Federal Reserve started to lower the interest rates, construction did actually pick up. And in the end, there was a good year in terms of housing starts, right? Professional and business service in the Inland Empire picking up a little, finally, right? And then government, leisure and hospitality, and healthcare. So John Husing and I looked at this and published a piece in Inland Empire newspapers, and later on I did an update with my student manager at the Low Institute, Yao Li. And here are the numbers. And they really show you what I'd indicated to you in the previous graph. Here's employment. And I look at 3 dates. I look at December in 2007, June 2014. Remember, that was the time when we came back. So there was this decline, and then we come up. And then March 2019, where basically we shot up, and we really did well. And so what does it show? Yep. Compared to 2007, we have now seen in the Inland Empire an increase of 13% in employment. California has 12%, the US has 9%, so we're doing well. Now what about if we look at hourly wages? Well, these are nominal wages, and so we're doing well, but we're not doing as well as California and the US. That's because certain sectors that are well-paying have not picked up in the Inland Empire as they have before. Now what I do is I adjust the hourly wages by the inflation rate, and this is where it gets scary. So compared to 2007 in the Inland Empire, we have seen a drop of 4% in hourly wages. Not only have we not reached those, we're below that, right? What about for California? Well, they also lost construction and they also lost manufacturing, but they had the business services that picked up for it. So they are up 9%, and the US is up 9% as well. So the reason why we're doing so well is not because the income that was generated, but the jobs that we had were relatively lower paying than for California and the United States, and that is where our gain comes from. So it looks good because employment went up, but we would wish that it would go up more in sectors that are more value added, right? This is something to think about once we come out of this hellhole that we're in currently with the coronavirus. This is some structural adjustment that we have to think about. The fourth industrial revolution is robotics, and I'll give you some examples here. This is a hamburger maker in Pasadena. And that is scarier to me because it means if you go to a bar, you cannot just be friendly with the barkeeper and maybe he or she will give you a little extra. There's not going to be any extra here. This is going to be precise. And so there we go. This is an interesting map. My friend and colleague Johannes Munoz at the University of Redlands has worked on what technology will do to jobs in different areas of the United States. And basically what these people have done is they've looked at tasks. So there are certain tasks that I do that can be automated and other tasks that cannot be automated. And they did this for every job and then looked at the jobs that were in different areas. And this is where the Inland Empire is going to hurt. A large number of jobs here will be automated. And you can be scared about this. But I think if we want to have a positive view on this, then what we should do is we should become the innovative center in logistics. In other words, if you look at the program of Regions Rising Together, we should convince the governor to spend some money into the Inland Empire becoming the logistics center, not only in terms of employment, but also in terms of research. If we embrace this, then actually we can turn this from something positive into something negative into something positive. Here's what has changed since the 1960s. Your skills, even though now you need more skills to do certain things like writing a report, there used to be more of a linear incline. In other words, if you didn't have a lot of skills, that was fine. If you had a lot of skills, you would see an increase in your pay, but it wouldn't be as steep. This is what it's now. In terms of computing statistics, everyone can compute a mean or a median, maybe run a regression. To write a report and to write it well, it takes a lot of skills, and that's what it pays off. Here was a scary statistics that had been passed around. It shows you the percent of jobs in each one of these professions that will be automated. This is not good news for accountants. I would be worried. And if you look at who the big accounting firms hired in terms of STEM majors recently, you would fully understand why accountants are worried these days. Here's economics. Not so good. Should I be worried? Well, here's clergy, and I think of myself as preaching economics, so I think I will be fine either way. I typically don't scream, and I had a 5th grade teacher in English who told me I can only use 3 exclamation marks in my entire life. This is the 3rd time I'm using it. I won't tell you what the other 2 were. It's not a supply side problem. It's a demand problem. And when we're looking at demand, there's some very simple factors. It's consumptions, that's what the households basically do. Investment, that's what the firms do. Government expenditures and exports, foreigners. The imports are to get away from components in here that are imports. 70% of the US GDP is consumption. So if you can explain consumption, or if you can prevent it from falling in a big way, then you're good. So this is where consumer sentiment will hit. Consumer sentiment in our next reading will go through the basement, I promise. And that is what will cause the brunt of the current slowdown. If we can prevent this from happening, that will be a big gain. And that is what Congress is trying to do today, by giving everyone a check of more than $1,000, by increasing unemployment insurance generosity, and so forth, right? If we can't do this, then we will be in trouble. If we can, it will be 2 quarters and we're good from there. What are the sectors that are worst and weakest? We talked about those a little. Health, as Chris Thornburg also pointed out, will be a big beneficial employment generator. The sector is actually called health and education. There won't be any declines in education. Currently the children are not in school, but they will come back to school, and the teachers are not being laid off. There's even talk about giving some money to part-time teachers and what have you. Logistics. Logistics looks good in terms of what currently is being shipped into the Inland Empire that comes from the rest of the United States. It looks horrible in terms of imports. And that is really what matters in terms of logistics in the Inland Empire. Leisure and hospitality, well, we don't have to talk about this. This is completely down. In some areas, it actually won't be that bad. Think of Coachella Valley. No one wants to go to Coachella Valley in the summer. I was there a year ago in June in Palm Springs, and it was 122 degrees. Things shut down. By the time the virus is over, we'll be in the fall, and maybe Coachella takes place, and they won't be that much affected. That's not the case for the rest of California and for the Inland Empire. This sector here is getting hit in a big way, and hopefully it's just a temporary shock. Retail sales, well, Vaughn's and Ralph's and Trader Joe's and Whole Food Goods are all doing well. You have to wait in line outside in order to get in these days. But those are not all the retail sales. I bet you if you now went to Cabazon, there wouldn't be many people in the factory outlets there. So if we talk looking at big department stores, then retail sales is also going to get hit in a hard way. Retail sales is good when it comes to food. For the rest of it, horrible. Mining. Not a problem in the Inland Empire, but you may have read that there is a price war at the moment going on between Russia and between Saudi Arabia. And the price of oil, therefore, is extremely low. Well, that will have an effect on the fracking industry in, let's say, Texas, in California, and in North Dakota. So there will be less investment from these sectors. They're not that much affected in the Inland Empire. Government, that's a hope, because in the last recession, government was counter-cyclical. A lot of times budgets for the government are set in the first part of the year, depending on tax income. And government has not seen the large decrease in tax income yet. And so therefore, the budget in terms of expenditures is still what was planned in from earlier days. Non-essential industries, we know that they're not going to do well. So that is the end of my presentation. If I want to make a summary, or to make a short story, or to make a long story short, for which it's too late, I would like to say that I am an optimist here. I'm looking at China, and I saw that China was out of the worst part of the problem within 2 months. If we can do the same thing, if we are out of this coronavirus problem by the end of May or by the beginning of May, then things will pick up. It will take some time for consumers to come back. Just because you're now allowed to leave your house does not mean that you're going to fly to Japan, or you're going to fly to Costa Rica, or you're going to take a holiday in the United States, right? So it will take some time, as we know from previous events like this, like 9/11 and so forth. It will take some time for consumers to come back out and spend. And I think that is also the important message for the housing sector. At the moment, it will take some time for people to come back out and to be assured of the income that they will have, and as a result, going together with low interest rates, pour more expenditures into the housing sector. I hope that in a year's time, if I'm invited back, it will be very easy to see if I'm invited back. If we have a boom within the next month, I know I won't be invited back. But if I will be invited back, I hope we can look back at this in terms of saying, yeah, we were in deep trouble, but we overcame it, and the economy is now stronger than it was before. Thank you very much for listening to the presentation.